Hey, what's up guys? This video is for section 2.5, which is solving equations involving absolute values. And the first thing we need to know is what is an absolute value. So the definition of absolute value is the distance of a number from 0 on a number line. So that's why you see a number line here on the screen. And I gave you guys two different absolute values, the absolute value of -8 and the absolute value of 8. Those vertical lines on the side, that's what it means. You read it as the absolute value. So the definition tells us that the distance from 0 to that number inside of the absolute value, that's going to be the answer. So I'm going to make points on the number line to show you guys where the numbers lie. So first, I'm going to show you the -8. -8 is right here. And when you look at the distance from that number to 0, 0 is right in the middle, right here. You can count how many units you have, and you will see that you have 8 units from that number to 0. So the absolute value of -8 is 8. We just want to know how far away is this number from 0. If you guys look at the other number, which is the absolute value of 8, well, same concept, same idea. +8 is right here on the number line, and if you count the units from 0 all the way to that number +8, it's also 8 units, or you can say 8 steps. But the absolute value of 8 is just 8. Now, if you pay attention to those absolute values, well, we have different numbers, -8 and +8, that have the same absolute value. So what that means is when you guys are solving an equation, we're going to have to think about that, because let me give you guys another absolute value here. If we have the absolute value of a number, and I don't know what that number is, but I know that the absolute value of that number equals 9, what that means is the number inside of the absolute value, we have two options. It can be either -9, because the absolute value of -9 is 9. That's how many units away from the 0 is the number. Or it can also be +9, which means that the absolute value of 9, +9, is also 9. That's how many units away. If you think about it, right here, 9 is 9 units away from 0. So the absolute value of 9 is 0, and the absolute value of -9 is 0. So we're going to have, when we solve an equation, we're going to have to make two different cases so we can know where the answer came from. We're going to have to do a negative case and a positive case. But first of all, we need to know how to work with absolute values. So we're going to evaluate first, and then we're going to solve for the equation. So you guys see these expressions here, they're not equations because we just want to evaluate. So that's what it says here, evaluate each expression. If A equals -2, there's B, C, X, Y, and Z. So looking at the expression, let's go ahead and look at this one here on the left side. 5 minus the absolute value of A plus Z. Over here we have 3 times the absolute value of C minus Z. Notice there's nothing in between the 3 and the absolute value. And then we have +1. And then we have -3A plus 2 times the absolute value of X minus B. And you guys see this one here on the right side. Now, absolute values, they actually work similar like parentheses. When you guys simplify or evaluate an expression with parentheses, well, we have to do what's inside of the parentheses first. That's the order of operation, PEMDAS. We're going to have to follow the same order here, PEMDAS, but we have to remember that absolute value is similar to parentheses, but they're not the same. So what I'm trying to say is, if you look at this expression here, we have a 3 outside of the absolute value. So if you have parentheses, well, you can distribute the 3. You can multiply by 3. Not here, because the absolute value is not like parentheses. It's very similar, but it's not like a parenthesis. So you're not going to distribute. You cannot distribute. Now, what we have to do, though, to evaluate the expression, we're going to substitute the values of the variables into the expression, and then we are going to evaluate. So let's look at the first one here. And I do have this one. So I am going to substitute the values A and Z. And you guys can see the numbers that correspond to A. So A equals -2, and I'm using parentheses because I substitute. And Z is -4, so I substitute that into the Z, and I'm using parentheses. So now we don't have any variables, but we are going to evaluate. So we have to do what's inside of the absolute value first. So let me put the absolute value right here. I'm going to bring down the minus and the 5. And inside the absolute value, we have -2 plus -4. They're inside parentheses, but that's all we have, a -2 plus a -4. And that's a -6. Now, you guys also need to pay attention to the signs and the absolute values. Very common, students think that when you have this here, a negative with absolute value and a negative next to it, that's a double negative where you guys can change that to positive. Well, guys, I just mentioned a second ago that absolute values is not the same as parentheses. So this is not actually double negative. It looks like it, but we have absolute value, so it's something different. So do not change this to plus. You actually have to evaluate. You have to find out what is the absolute value of -6. So when I'm looking at this part, absolute value of -6, well, that's going to be +6. And many teachers, that's what they say. When you have the absolute value of a number, just turn the number inside to positive. And that's what happens when you have absolute value. But the concept, the idea is the number -6 is 6 units away from 0 on the number line. So let me bring down the 6. That's what we need. No more absolute value because we know the absolute value of -6 is 6. I'm going to bring down the minus and the 5. So notice there's the minus and the 5. Now we can actually finish the problem. 5 minus 6 is -1. So the next one here, we have 3 times the absolute value of C minus Z plus a 1. Now we are multiplying the 3 and the absolute value, but I'm not going to distribute because it's not, absolute value is not the same as parentheses. So what we do is we are going to bring down the 3, and I like to put a times here to say that I'm multiplying the absolute value of C minus Z, and then we have plus 1. But we do need to substitute the C and the Z inside the absolute value, so let me do that right now. And you guys see the values for C and Z inside of the absolute value. Now you have to follow the order operation and you do what's inside the absolute value first. So if you look at inside this one here, notice that we do have a minus and a minus next to each other, but we do have a parenthesis in between. So this is actually double negative. You guys can change that to a plus because we do have parentheses in between the two negatives. If you guys have absolute value in between the two negatives, you cannot change that to a plus, but this one you can. So let me do that right now. So I did change those two negatives into positive. So now I'm going to finish what's inside of the absolute value. So let me bring down the absolute value here, and that's going to be 6. 2 plus 4 is 6. Let me bring down the times 3 and the plus 1. Now you guys need to finish the problem. The absolute value of 6, which is positive 6, the absolute value of positive 6 is just positive 6. So you don't need the absolute values anymore. You bring down the times, the 3, and plus 1. Now order operation says you need to multiply before you add. PEM does. You have to multiply before you add. So I'm going to multiply 3 times 6. That's 18 plus 1. And my answer will be 19. Now this one here, you are going to multiply the absolute value by 2. 2 times the absolute value by x minus b. But we also have a negative 3a, which is multiplying negative 3 times a. So first, let's go ahead and substitute the values of a, x, and b into that expression. So you see the values of a, x, and b. A is negative 2, x is negative 1, and b is negative 3. So I substitute those values into the expression. I am going to do what's inside of the absolute value, and notice that we do have double negatives here, so I am going to change that to plus right here. So all of this right here inside of the absolute value became negative 1 plus 3 because you guys have double negative. Let's go ahead and finish what's inside of the absolute value. And negative 1 plus 3 is positive 2. Now remember that in between the 2 and the absolute value, we're actually multiplying. So let me put the multiplication times, the multiplication sign in between. You can actually do that here too and up here. So you guys remember that you are multiplying by 2. So let's go ahead and finish the problem. I know that the absolute value of 2 is 2. And I'm going to bring down the times, the 2, the plus, and I also have to multiply this 2 right here because we do have parentheses in between, negative 3 times negative 2, and that's going to be positive 6. Now here, guys, you also have to follow the order of operation because we do have to multiply before we add. So you actually have to multiply those two numbers, the 2 and the 2, 2 times 2. That's going to be 4. You bring down the plus, the 6, and you add 6 plus 4 is 10. And this one here, you have negative absolute value of 5a plus c plus the absolute value of 3y plus 2z. Now that negative right there, guys, it actually has an invisible 1. So we do have a negative 1 in front of the absolute value. And since I don't have anything in between, I will multiply the negative 1 times the absolute value. But you're not going to distribute. Remember, this is not parentheses. You actually have to evaluate, and then after you find the absolute value, whatever is inside, then you multiply by negative 1. So I'm going to substitute the values of a, c, y, and z. And you guys see all those values in the expression. Now we have to understand the problem. First of all, we do have two different absolute values. I'm trying to make this darker so you guys can differentiate. So we have those vertical lines, absolute value. I am multiplying the negative 1 times this absolute value, and then I'm adding this absolute value. So first, let me bring down the negative 1 times, and let's do what's inside of the absolute value here. Order operation, I have to multiply before I add. So I'm going to have absolute value, and 5 times negative 2, that's negative 10, plus 2. The 2 is by itself, so I just bring it down. I don't need the parentheses anymore. Plus, and I have my other absolute value right here. So let's follow the order of operation. You multiply before you add. So 3 times 3, that's going to be 9. And then you have to multiply plus 2 times negative 4. Now we have to be careful with the signs because this is a positive 2 times a negative 4. Positive plus, that's a positive, times negative. That's going to be a negative, and 2 times 4 is 8. Let's go ahead and finish the problem. You guys bring down the negative 1 times the absolute value, and we have negative 10 plus 2, that's negative 8, plus, and we have the absolute value over here, and 9 minus 8 is 1. We're not done. We have to find the absolute value. Now, another common mistake that students do is if you look at the negative 1 times absolute value negative 8, do not multiply negative 1 times negative 8 because you have to find the absolute value of this number first. So don't just say negative 1 times negative 8, oh, I'm going to put a positive 8. That's the wrong step. You have to evaluate the absolute value. So let's go ahead and find the absolute value of negative 8, which is positive 8. So you put the 8 right there. You bring down the times and the negative 1, plus, and the absolute value of a positive 1 is just 1. So now you guys follow the order of operation. You multiply before you add. So negative 1 times 8, that's negative 8, plus the 1 over here, and the answer is negative 7. All right, guys, this concludes my video for evaluating absolute values when they give you guys different values, different variables. But I will make a second part of this lesson, so a second video. Make sure you guys check that out. And if you like my videos, you can hit that like button. You can also subscribe to my channel. Make sure you guys practice, and I'll see you guys later.